What's going to happen with Cuba now that it can't really depend on Venezuelan oil in order to prop up its economy? Well, some people are claiming that it could lead to uh, another special period. That's what happened in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell apart. And basically, the issue is that Cuba doesn't really have many natural resources, and it can't really afford to pay a premium from countries that are oil producers. You know, there's a few oil producers in the area. Besides Venezuela, there would be Trinidad, as well as Ecuador, and there could probably be a few more in the Caribbean region. Now, my question would be, I have no clue what the answer is, so I'm actually literally asking the question. Uh, Cuba and Russia actually have a good relationship. Why isn't it that Russia would become the new source of oil for Cuba? I'm assuming that it does cost a lot more because of the transportation costs, but you kind of get the idea. So it says here that an advisor or a consultant is saying that Cuba could be at the doors of a new special period. It says the special period that is going through Cuba is probably going to intensify in the next few months. And unless they open up the market system, the country could fall into a new special period, which was the serious depression into which it fell in the 90s, according to the Havana Consulting Group, which is based in Miami. Okay, so bear in mind there are a lot of Cuban exile groups in Miami and then the surrounding area that would they're probably rooting for Cuba to fail anyway. Although, to be honest with you, where have they succeeded? And it says, in fact, the worsening of the Cuban economy is being observed not only in the form of the scarcity of dollarized stores, nor in the lack of subsidized products of basic necessities such as bread and eggs, says Emilio Morales, the president of this group that is helping to understand the Cuban economy and its consumers. So it says in the report that Cuba urgently needs to open up the market economy in order to liberate or liberalize for once and for all the productive forces and to permit investment for the Cuban citizens in their own country. Or otherwise, there will be a reappearance of the ghost of the special period, which will come to pass. Now, this sounds like a lot of scare tactics, but the fact of the matter is, let's look at it objectively, okay? And you guys probably know I'm no fan of the Cuban system, of the Castro government or anything, but I would say this. If you have their main source of petroleum is basically incapacitated, and in fact, in the past few days, I believe the U.S. actually declared that they consider Venezuelan oil tankers and Venezuelan crude that's being transported towards Cuba to basically be contraband now that you have all these issues of Maduro imprisoning journalists and Maduro having, this dust up at the border, which some of it is not his fault and some of it is obviously he's screwing up royally. Cuba's in deep shit right now. And the country is kind of at a different point than during the special period of the 90s. And it's for a very simple reason. You see, the generation of Cubans that went through the revolution, many of them were willing to see the radical change that Fidel was talking about because they were hoping, yes, we would arrive at a time when we'd be liberated from these issues that happened under Batista, who was the previous dictator, being basically a U.S. pawn, all the corruption, the lack of any services or any opportunity for the poorer Cubans. that was really the point of being a Cuban during the revolutionary period. And by the way, they were part of the Eastern Bloc. They were part of the world revolutionary socialism. And Fidel was an icon of it. Che Guevara was also an icon of it. This was a big thing. Now, once Fidel, during the end of the Cold War, once the Soviets weren't an ally, it became a little more about not just the Cuban communism and the revolution, but out and out nationalism, how the Yankee imperialists would not bring down Cuba, and how the system would adapt. And that's how they sustained themselves at the expense of many of their own people, who, by the way, were by no means rich to begin with. And Cuba was never a very strong economy, and it's never actually been able to carve out for itself a role in the world economy. They've always been kind of, unless you have tourism and things like that, they don't have many draws for their economy. There's health tourism, though, because some of Cuba's hospitals are pretty good. But in reality, they just don't seem to be able to break free of their pattern of just being incapable of providing a way to the future for Cubans. So under Castro, that was all well and good. Then came the Chavez period, when Cuba was allied to the government over in Venezuela. And of course, there were a few other governments that became very sympathetic to Cuba at the time, including Brazil and Ecuador, you could say Nicaragua especially. So this raises the question, now that some of those countries have already bolted from the ALBA bloc, which is the association of, I think it's the Alliance of Bolivarian Liberated States or something. The ALBA bloc has basically fallen apart, and Cuba is almost adrift. They're still holding on to Venezuela. Nicaragua, sure, but there's not much to get. I mean, Nicaragua, I'll be honest with you, there's not much in terms of economic resources there. So the Cuban people are almost orphaned, apart from some alliances with Russia and with China. So I would say that in the coming period, you're going to see a little bit of a different effect over there. Fidel is gone. His brother Raul is retired, and the current president, I think his name is Diaz-Canel. So people are looking at it and they're like, well, we've already had 3 generations of people who have lived through this communist revolution, and the revolution never seems to progress anywhere. It just seems to keep all of the old garbage, afloat. The cars are still the same old cars. The buildings are the same old buildings. Cuba is basically, it's a country frozen in time in many ways. And some people say, well, that's the charm of the country. Why should we ever change it? Okay, that the fact of the matter is a lot of people want to leave because it won't change. So that's not the way, in my opinion, to manage a country. Of course, I think most Americans would not want a direct U.S. intervention across the, whatever it's called, the Florida Strait, I think it's called. So they don't want to see American troops flown into Cuba to get into a war. But we could see in our time some sort of evolution of the Cuban government in the way that this article is suggesting. So yeah, the special period, I'm not sure how that will happen and what will be the exact issue that finally forces a huge change towards a market economy, which I think will probably come at some point, but I could be wrong. But there's definitely signs that it's happening. So please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to my other channel, Razor Ray Special Cuts. You can also see most of my social media in the comment section, and it should be on Dissenter, even though at the moment Dissenter isn't working. So sorry about that. Tomorrow night, or rather tonight on Thursday. So tonight, Thursday, we should have at some point a kind of a guest segment with Gabriel, who's been talking about Venezuela, talking about some interesting stuff that I've seen about it. And yeah, I'm very interested. I don't believe we should send troops to those countries, but we shouldn't forget what's going on there. And those people, they have lives too. We have to look at them not as these dupes or whatever. I mean, some of them are dupes, but in the end, you're seeing a lot of innocent people just suffer for nothing. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.